This program is brought to you by the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center, also known as HERC, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm Samantha Abramson, Executive Director at HERC. On behalf of our Board of Directors and our staff, we thank you so much for joining us for today's program. For more than 2 decades, through the lens of Holocaust education, HERC has been dedicated to building a more just society based on the values of dignity, tolerance, and respect for all human beings. HERC is responsible for programs that connect students and educators with Holocaust survivors and leading experts in the field to learn from their stories and their knowledge, and to remember, educate, and inspire. At HERC, we are so proud that according to a recent study done by the Claims Conference, Wisconsin, true to our state's motto, Forward, leads the way in student awareness of the Holocaust. We're excited and humbled in the knowledge that our work is only just getting started. HERC is poised and ready to serve the needs of our state's students and educators through digital and in-person resources. Through HERC's world-class programming and educational resources for students, teachers, and communities, we open doors for challenging and critical conversations that need to happen. Conversations that help us not only wrestle with the questions of how the Holocaust happened and why the world failed to stop it, but also invite us to take steps as individuals and collectively to become upstanders in our communities. We need to send the message that acts of hate won't go unchecked on our watch. Our programming is made possible thanks to the generosity of our audiences. We encourage you to visit our website, holocaustcentermilwaukee.org/support, to make a gift. Your generous gift in support of our work will allow us to continue developing cutting-edge programs like today's. Together, we can inspire future generations and make the world a more just society for all. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's program, The Inextinguishable Symphony, a true story of music and love in Nazi Germany. I'm Carrie Altman, Director of Outreach and Community Programming at the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center, otherwise known as HERC, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you to our event co-sponsors, Congregation Emmanuel B'nai Jeshurun and the Harry and Rose Sampson Family Jewish Community Center. And thank you to all of you watching for your continued support of HERC's mission. Mr. Martin Goldsmith is the author of the book, The Inextinguishable Symphony, a true story of music and love in Nazi Germany. In the book, he shares the riveting story of the Kulturbund, an all-Jewish performing arts ensemble that was maintained by the Nazis between 1933 and 1941, an ensemble that included Mr. Goldsmith's parents. The Inextinguishable Symphony is the basis of the acclaimed 2019 film Winter Journey. As many of you may know, Martin Goldsmith has been a classical music radio programmer and presenter for 50 years. He semi-retired 3 years ago from Sirius XM satellite radio in Washington, D.C., where he now hosts afternoon music programs. For 10 years, he served as the host of Performance Today, National Public Radio's daily classical music program. Mr. Goldsmith will be interviewed by Milwaukee's very own Jody Hirsch. Jody is a talented musician, playwright, and the former director of Judaic education at the Harry and Rose Sampson Family Jewish Community Center. Immediately following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A box anytime throughout the presentation. And now it is an honor to introduce Mr. Martin Goldsmith and Mr. Jody Hirsch.
There we go. I see it. There he is.
All
Okay.
right. All right.
So thank you so much for joining us. You know, I have to say, I really loved your book. And you know, I've taught Holocaust, I've studied Holocaust, and I knew about the Kulturbund, kind of, but I had no idea really what it was before reading your book. So if we could just start by, you know, your book is largely about the Jewish Kulturbund that was in Germany during the Nazi regime. Can you, what was this? Tell us what this is.
Well, thank you, Jody. It is quite a fascinating story. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. And though the Nazis had many things on their plate, many things they hoped to accomplish, one of the first things they started to do was to evict Jews from their positions with German orchestras, opera companies, and theater companies. So that by the early spring of 1933, there were literally dozens of now unemployed Jewish artists. And some of them came together in the late spring and early summer of 33 to form what they called a Kulturbund, a cultural association, figuring that if they could no longer make art for their fellow Germans, they could make art for their fellow German Jews. They appointed as their director a man by the name of Kurt Singer, a neurologist and the former conductor of a choir in Berlin. And Herr Singer was savvy enough to realize he probably couldn't get anywhere without assistance from the National Socialists. So he knocked on a number of doors and discovered this man named Hans Hinkel, who was sort of second in line to Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who was the head of what was called the Department of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And Herr Goebbels, a master of propaganda that he was, immediately realized that this could be a useful tool to deflect whatever criticism there may be from overseas as to how the Germans were treating the Jews in their country. So the Kulturbund opened its doors for the first time during the high holidays of 1933. They put on plays, they put on orchestra concerts, chamber music concerts, they staged operas, they eventually showed films, all for the Jews of Germany to perform with the Kulturbund, to play the violin or to play the flute, or to dance with the Kulturbund, or to be a singer or an actor, or to take tickets at the box office, or even to clean the lavatories. You had to be Jewish. And only Jews were allowed to attend Kulturbund performances. So it was very much a closed society. But this was anything but a Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, hey kids, let's put on a show kind of organization. Some of the very finest artists in all of Germany were members of the Kulturbund. It was said, and in fact it was the case, that the first violin section of the Kulturbund Orchestra in Berlin contained 8 former concertmasters of German orchestras, but these were people, of course, who had been kicked out of their positions earlier in 33. They did very, very good work, and as you say, my parents managed to become a part of the Kulturbund.
That's really amazing. And, you know, I have to say that one thing that really struck me, it's one of the conductors, the brilliant conductors that you talk about is Hans Wilhelm Steinberg, who he managed to get out. He went to Palestine and he organized the Palestine Orchestra Symphony, which later became the Israel Philharmonic. But I knew him. Why? Because I grew up in Pittsburgh, and when he came to America, he Americanized his name to William Steinberg. And I was this geeky kid that liked going to the symphony. And I grew up with William Steinberg. Mm-hmm. I had no idea that he was you know, a Holocaust survivor. And in fact, I don't think I ever heard him speak, or I would have heard his German accent. So
he was the conductor of the Kulturbund Orchestra of Frankfurt.
Right, of Frankfurt. Yeah.
Which is where my parents met.
That's exactly right. So one of the things, I mean, first of all, your book, it's a history of Nazi Germany and of specifically your parents. But it really reads like a novel. Honestly, it is so easy to read this in such a compelling story. So, and I think the best part about the book is that it alternates information about the rise of the Nazis and the Nazi regimes. It has facts and figures and dates. But it also is about the unfolding story about your parents. And that is just so important, because when you just read the history of what this restriction was and that restriction, it's just so abstract. But the fact that it alternates between this factual stuff and the impact on real human beings, that is just like so compelling. So I wonder if you could read us a passage from your book that kind of illustrates the impact on your father, actually.
Sure. Well, let me just back up just a bit to explain how they managed to end up in Frankfurt. My mother played the viola. She auditioned for and was accepted by Hans Wilhelm Steinberg into the Kulturbund Orchestra of Frankfurt am Main when she was 18 years old in 1935. And shortly thereafter, the Nuremberg laws were announced in September of 1935, which did all kinds of nasty things and stripped Jews of their German citizenship and other stuff. And my father, who was 22 years old at the time and studying the flute in Karlsruhe, a town about 100 miles south of Frankfurt, decided that he had had enough and that he was going to leave the country of his birth. And over the next several months, he actually found himself an apartment above a milk bar in Stockholm. He decided that he would emigrate to Sweden. And literally just days before he was due to leave Karlsruhe for Sweden, the phone rang in his apartment, and the fellow at the other end of the phone asked if he could be persuaded to come up to Frankfurt and perform with this Kulturbund orchestra. The flutist of the orchestra had come down sick. And at first my father said, well, no, I've got boxes all over the apartment. I'm going to be moving to Sweden in a couple of days. But the other fellow was quite persuasive. And so my dad said, okay, I'll be there. He threw some things into a suitcase and took the train up to Frankfurt. And over the next couple of days, he rehearsed with and played 2 concerts with the Kulturbund, one in Frankfurt and one in Hamburg. And then, in fact, he duly moved to Sweden. However, he couldn't forget the lovely young violist he had met during his time in Frankfurt and in Hamburg. And well, let me explain. As you say, Jody, I'll read just a portion of the book which has to do with that part of the story. Here we go. I'm terribly sorry. I thought I had it. Here we go. Here we go. So yes, they played these 2 concerts in Stockholm, in Frankfurt and in Hamburg. And from the book, the next day, just hours before leaving for Sweden, Günther, my father was named Günther Ludwig Goldschmidt when he was born, and my mother was Rosemary Gumpert. The next day, just hours before leaving for Sweden, Günther mailed Rosemary a copy of Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I have the volume before me now, a precious relic. On the first page is the following inscription, in German naturally: Rosemary Gumpert, a small memento of 2 concerts, Tchaikovsky, in Frankfurt and Hamburg in March 1936, signed G.G. The main work on the program was the Great Pathétique Symphony by Tchaikovsky. So he signed his letter G.G. I wonder which of Rilke's gentle and profound observations made the greatest impression on the sender and on the recipient. More than 60 years later, 2 in particular strike me. Rilke wrote, "Destiny is like a wonderful wide tapestry in which every thread is guided by an unspeakably tender hand placed beside another thread and held and carried by 100 others." And Rilke also wrote, "It is always my wish that you find enough patience within yourself to endure and enough innocence to have faith. Believe me, life is right in all cases." A few days later, Günther was thrilled to receive a return envelope from Frankfurt. Inside, he found an enthusiastic letter from Rosemary, thanking him for the book and expressing her happiness at having met him. But she had addressed the letter to Gustav Goldschmidt, apparently confusing him with the King of Sweden. It must have been a wee bit exasperating for Günther to think that he had made so little an impression upon the object of his affections that she couldn't even remember his name. But having inherited my mother's occasional difficulties with such matters, I can only smile with love and indulgence. What indeed is in a name? Thus began an ardent correspondence between Frankfurt and Stockholm. And believing, as Rilke did, in a beautifully woven destiny and in the rightness of life, Günther, after spending 6 months in the white night safety of Sweden and engaging in a regular and intense correspondence with Rosemary, decided to go back to Germany to be with her. The opportunity presented itself when the same flutist who'd caught cold in March fled to Palestine in August. Foolishly, or romantically, or both, my father accepted the position of principal flutist of the Frankfurt Kulturbund Orchestra. Would I have done the same thing? Whatever my answer, I have the advantage of hindsight, of knowing the terrors of the next 10 years. But still, even in the late summer of 1936, my father must have known what a damn fool thing he was doing, deliberately, and with all his faculties intact, voluntarily going back to Nazi Germany, to the country whose leader had vowed to eradicate his kind from the earth forever. And for what? For love, for music and for love. I don't know if I would have done it, but I do know that I love and admire him for it. I think it's the most wonderful story I know. So yes, in short, my father moved back from Sweden to go back to Nazi Germany to be with this woman who would become his mother, his wife and my mother.
It's just fantastic. And again, as you say, with hindsight, you want to scream at him and say, bring her to Sweden, forget this, but that's, how could they know? How could they know? Right. So tell us about your family back in Germany.
Sure. Well, there's a slide from 1914, the year the First World War began. On the left is my father's older sister, Bertha. To her left is my grandfather, Alex. To his left is my grandmother, Tony. And sitting on Tony's lap is my father, Günther. He's aged about 6 months at that point. The gentleman there, the older gentleman, my grandfather, Alex Goldschmidt, was born in a little village called Sachsenhagen. His father and his grandfather, my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, both were cattle dealers and horse traders in this little village in Lower Saxony. But Alex wanted none of that. He moved to the relatively big city of Oldenburg, where he met Tony Behrens, the daughter of Ludwig Behrens, who was a coffee magnate in Bremen, the town of the famous town musicians. And Alex managed to open up a very successful women's clothing store. He marched off in 1914, just a few months after this photograph was taken, to his regiment in Sachsenhagen, and he went off and fought in the Great War. Miraculously, he survived, came back in 1919, by which time the store had been doing extremely well. And if you could show the next slide, you will see an advertisement for my grandfather's store at the top there. You see the words Alex Goldschmidt, which actually came from a neon sign of that design. I think it was the first neon sign in downtown Oldenburg. But if you go then to the right of that and cast your eyes down, you'll see the word Canada, and below that you will see an advertisement for the local Nazi party. You'll see the swastika and the eagle. The ad explains that there will be a meeting of the local National Socialists, and I find that this came from a newspaper in 1929, an Oldenburg newspaper of 1929, which explains that even several years before Hitler became Chancellor of all Germany, the National Socialists were doing very, very well in Oldenburg. In fact, Oldenburg was the first city and the first state to elect Nazi leadership. And I guess the next slide is my mom back in 1935. This is shortly after she auditioned for and became a member of the Kulturbund Orchestra in Frankfurt. And the next slide is that of my father playing his flute from a couple of years thereafter, maybe after he'd come back to Germany. So that's a very brief look at my family. I know a bit more about my father's side of the family than my mother's side, but that is who they were. They were my grandfather was extremely successful in his business until he was forced to sell his house for far less than it was worth. The boycott of April 1st, 1933 hurt his business. And by 1938, he was arrested on the night of Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938. And we may get into that story a bit later, but that's the background of my mother and father.
Great. So, you know, it strikes me that this story of the Kulturbund really, it kind of has two prongs to it, you know. So one is about these musicians themselves. You know, these were out of work musicians. They couldn't work in Nazi Germany, but they worked for the Kulturbund, which even managed to raise money and pay them salaries, you know. So on the one hand, it's about these musicians and how, you know, what they love is music and they're still able to do it and even have salaries for it. But it strikes me that the other prong of this is the fact that people, the Jews who couldn't go to concerts, German concerts, they could actually go to concerts to the Kulturbund, the Jewish Kulturbund, you know. So could you say a few things about, just about how did the Kulturbund actually save your parents' lives? It did, didn't it?
It certainly did. I should say that the first Kulturbund opened in Berlin in the autumn of 1933 with a play Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise by Gotthold Lessing. A few weeks after that, they staged Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro. And again, they had concerts, operas, plays. And the Kulturbund was under the direction of Herr Goebbels, Herr Dr. Goebbels, and the Gestapo. And they quickly ruled that for a Jew to speak the words of Goethe or Schiller, or for a Jewish musician to perform music by Beethoven or Schumann or Brahms, in other words, for a Jew to perform a German play or German symphony was just too much. It was blasphemy. So Jews, the Kulturbund was forbidden from performing music by German composers or putting on plays by German playwrights. And later, after the Anschluss in 1938, Austrian composers were added to the banned list. So they couldn't play Haydn or Schubert or Mozart, but they could play all the Jewish composers they wanted, Mendelssohn and Mahler, and any foreign-born composers, Igor Stravinsky, Maurice Ravel, Carl Nielsen. But it was very much a closed organization, but it was very protective of the musicians and actors and dancers who performed. Again, Goebbels was a master of propaganda. And as the 30s lengthened, 33, 34, 35, 36, more and more people from around the world in diplomatic or political positions of authority were raising questions of the stories that they'd heard of how the Jews in Germany were being treated. And Goebbels was able to point to the Kulturbund and say, well, look, they have their own orchestra, they have their own opera company. I mean, if we were really treating them badly, would we allow them to do things like that? Of course not. What you're hearing is just fake news. Pay no attention to it. So the Kulturbund was allowed to, and in fact encouraged by the Nazis to continue. And in fact, there was one moment in the history of the Kulturbund when they actually had the upper hand, and that was after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, also known as the German pogrom of 1938, was this attack unleashed on the Jews of Germany from border to border, where businesses were broken into, synagogues were burned, Torahs were burned, and thousands of Jews were stomped to death, and many were arrested, my grandfather among them. But that did provide the Germans with a fairly black eye. If you go back and look at just American newspapers at the time, and the New York Times, Washington Post, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I'm sure the Milwaukee Journal, all of those newspapers carried the story of Kristallnacht on the front page above the fold. And it was quite obvious that there was all this violence being set loose against the Jews of Germany. So Goebbels was more eager than ever to get the Kulturbund back performing so we could deflect, and deflect. But so many members of the Kulturbund had been arrested on Kristallnacht, many of them sent to Dachau, that the leaders of the Kulturbund at the time very wisely realized that they kind of had Goebbels over a barrel at this one moment, because they could very rightfully say, well, we can't perform with all of these members of our organization behind bars, so please release them. So Goebbels agreed, the musicians were released, and it was on the 27th of November 1938 that the Kulturbund came back and gave their first concert after Kristallnacht. So as I say, it's, in brief, to make a much longer story much shorter, anybody connected to the Kulturbund was golden there for a while. They were protected. As you say, Jody, they were able to even earn a small salary. So had my parents not been a member of the Kulturbund, I'm sure they would have been arrested, and God knows what would have happened to them.
I think there's even an additional thing. I mean, your parents played at the American Embassy in Berlin, right? How did that have an effect on their future? Oh,
tremendous amount. Yes, there were so many things. Jody, you mentioned earlier the slow increase of laws and edicts issued against the Jews, starting in 1933 with the civil service law, which declared Jewish doctors and lawyers unable to practice except for other Jews. Driver's licenses of Jewish citizens were declared invalid. Jews were not allowed to own radios. Jews were not allowed to own pets. The public swimming area at Lake Wannsee in Berlin was declared off limits to Jews. There was a curfew. There was an edict saying that Jews could not go to grocery stores and purchase groceries until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Stores always opened around 9 o'clock in the morning and closed at 5. So by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, only the stringiest meats or the less ripe fruits and vegetables were available. But Jews could not shop until 4 o'clock, when all the good stuff had been taken off the shelves. And there was a curfew issued against the Jews. They had to be off the streets by 8 p.m. during the winter and 9 p.m. during the summertime. But my parents, crazy in love though they were, or as they were, often ignored the curfews to sneak through the streets of Berlin to play chamber music with their friends. They would often doubly enjoy themselves if they played Brahms or Beethoven or Schumann or Bach, playing this forbidden German music. And as I say, they would often play with their friends, and so they got the reputations of being very dependable chamber music players. And one evening in either late 39 or early 1940, they were invited to participate in a series of chamber music concerts at the American Embassy in Berlin, just very near the Brandenburg Gate. And they became somewhat well known at the embassy. They were there more than once. They were introduced by a woman my father remembered only as Mrs. Schneider, who introduced them to this wonderful cheese made in this faraway land called Wisconsin. And they eventually called on Mrs. Schneider to help them apply for visas to leave the United States. And one of my mother's father's students, my mother's father was a violinist and professor of violin in Dusseldorf. One of his former students had moved to America, saw what happened on Kristallnacht, wrote to his former teacher, my grandfather, saying, can we do anything to help? And my grandfather said, yes, my daughter and her new husband need to be sponsored to come to America. So this fellow, whom my father remembered only as Mr. Shapiro, threw a big party in New York City's Chinatown to raise enough money to sponsor these two kids from Germany. But that all happened because Mrs. Schneider at the embassy was able to help them fill out all of these papers. So that was crucial. They were extraordinarily lucky.
It was amazing. So, you know, in the prologue of your book, you mentioned the Wagner's opera Die Walküre, and there's an ash tree. This is an important set piece, you know, that fills the house of Hunding at the beginning of that opera, you know, and the ash tree, you write, filled your own home, but was never discussed. So that was kind of your way of mentioning what we might call the elephant in the room. You know, your parents, who were really saved from death by the fact that they were musicians, they never talked about Nazi Germany. They didn't tell you stories of their growing up, you know. So how did you piece together this book? I mean, it's so full of details about your parents, your family, you know. How did you find out these details?
Well, let me just first briefly tell the story of my family, my mother, my father, my older brother, and me. We were four, and we were never told not to talk about Nazi Germany. We were never told, don't ask any questions. We just sort of knew, in the way kids have, of being aware of what's going on in the house. We just, as I write in the book, we didn't discuss what had happened in Nazi Germany for the same reason we never discussed bauxite mining in Peru. These were just subjects that didn't come up. My brother once asked my father, hey, all of our friends, you know, go to Thanksgiving with their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles. How come we don't have any grandparents and aunts and uncles? And my father replied briefly, they died in the war. That's all he would say. He had felt a good deal of guilt for having survived, and his family, I mean, his mother, his father, his younger brother, his younger sister, they were all murdered by the Nazis. And so he was very reluctant to speak of anything. I knew that my parents had been a part of this all-Jewish orchestra in Nazi Germany, but I didn't know any details. But eventually I was persuaded by somebody up the road in Baltimore to try to make a book out of the whole thing. And I began at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where I learned a number of interesting facts and figures. And among them was the fact that in 1992, the Akademie der Künste, a museum in Berlin, had mounted an exhibition about the Kulturbund. And they published this amazing catalog, which I acquired. And then this was in the fall of 1998. I made my first trip to Germany. I flew into Frankfurt, where my parents had lived for a while. I knew the address where they lived. I went to visit that, and then I went to the place where the Kulturbund concerts were given. And the concert hall was no more, but there was a music academy right there. I walked in, I asked if anybody could tell me anything about the Kulturbund, and I was directed to a fellow by the name of Martini, who had actually written a book about the Frankfurt Kulturbund. So I learned a great deal of information about the Frankfurt organization from him. And the Berlin Kulturbund was covered just absolutely from top to bottom by this catalog from the Akademie der Künste. It listed every single theater event, every single chamber music event, every single orchestral event, every single opera that was performed. So I was able to get a great deal of information from those two sources about the Kulturbund. And then my interest having been fired, I had all of these conversations with my father, many of which are replicated in this movie that Carrie mentioned, Winter Journey, where my father is played by the wonderful late actor Bruno Ganz. So it was a matter of gathering information both personally and about their lives as musicians in Germany.
So, I mean, a lot of it was your research, just a bit of it in conversations with your father, I guess, who I understand was kind of reluctant to really talk about it. But
He was reluctant, but eventually he did come around. In 1994, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, D.C. And my father did not come to Washington to go to the museum, but he happened to be in town. And I suggested we go down to see the museum. And there may be people here tuning in who have been to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., but you go into an elevator, which takes you up to the third floor, and you sort of wind your way down to the first floor. When the elevator opens, the first thing you see is this immense photograph of General Eisenhower liberating prisoners at one of the concentration camps in Germany. And my father came with me to the Holocaust Museum and took one look at that photograph and gasped and tried to get back into the elevator. But the elevator doors had already closed. So I steadied him, and we walked through the exhibition, and we came to a place where there was an oboe attached to the wall. And my father looked at the signage and said, "I sat right next to this man in the Berlin Kulturbund Orchestra." He sat right next to the fellow who owned that oboe in the orchestra. And so his tongue became loosened, and I began asking more and more questions. And there were some things that he remembered in great detail, some of which were almost embarrassing. He told me in some detail about the first time he and my mom spent the night together on New Year's Eve, 1937/38. And other things he claimed not to remember, things that may have been more painful. But yes, I got a great deal, a fairly large percentage of what went into the book was the result of my conversations with my dad.
Well, so, I've taught Holocaust, and a couple of years ago, I taught a class about the 19th century salons in Germany, which all had Jewish hostesses. And so one question I get from my students all the time is, why didn't the Jews of Germany see the handwriting on the wall? I mean, why didn't they leave when they could? And actually, this question actually occupies a lot of your book. Now, your book is primarily about musicians and about your grandparents. Only one of them, I think, was a musician, but of the grandparents. But how would you respond to this question? Who did see the handwriting on the wall, and who didn't, and why?
That, as you say, Jody, that's a very interesting and very complex question. On the one hand, there was the fact that, as my grandfather Alex believed, I mean, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his service to the country in World War I. And as the Nazis grew in importance and influence, my grandfather would often say to anyone who would listen, "I fought for the Kaiser. Hitler can't touch me." And he would actually he would wear his little ring or his Iron Cross as some sort of a talisman that somehow that was good enough, which of course it was not. But he couldn't see what was coming. The German people there is a saying in Germany. I don't know what it is in German, but the translation is, "No meal is eaten as hot as it is cooked." The point being that, Adolf Hitler was this clown. He made big speeches, he gestured, he shouted at the top of his voice. He's making a big fuss, but should he ever come to power, what's the worst he could do? So there was that inability to see over the horizon. But then, if that question persists, I sometimes say to myself, well, why didn't the American people in the autumn of 2021, why were they unable to foresee what happened in 2024 and all of the things that happened thereafter? Why couldn't they have apprehended that? Well, because no one can predict the future, and the idea of leaving Germany was not one that most people wanted to entertain. As my father used to say, we were from here. The Nazis were the invaders. We belonged here. And in fact, after my parents came here, they waited 21 years before going back to Germany. I was 10 at the time and went along. But several times thereafter, my father went back to his hometown of Oldenburg, which is a lovely little town in the northwest portion of the country. And he wanted to reclaim what he thought of as his country for himself. So as I say, it's sort of a long, complex story. But there were members of the Kulturbund who were told by Kurt Singer, the artistic director, we need you. We're going to be staging Verdi's La Traviata next month, and I want you to sing the lead. But one of the people I interviewed who were former members of the Kulturbund was a dancer, and she was called upon to stay, but her family insisted that she come with them. And all of her friends in the Kulturbund said, well, you will see, you'll become crawling back with your tail between your legs in just a couple of years, whereas we're going to become these great Kulturbund artists. And the woman, the dancer I spoke to said, all of them perished. We were lucky.
Wow. So one of the most wonderful things about the book, I thought, is that you talk about some of the specific things that were performed by your parents, specific works that were performed by the Jewish Kulturbund. And, so for example, one thing that you mentioned is a production of Rigoletto. So some of you know the story of Rigoletto. There's a curse, La Maledizione, at the very beginning, right? And it's the curse that kind of drives the entire thing. And so one of the performers told your parents that, well, there's a curse, we're under a curse, And so in other words, what you do is you mention a work of music, but you make it so symbolic and powerful and relevant to the situation. So for example, one of the things toward the end of the existence of the Kulturbund that you talk about is a performance of Mahler's incredible Resurrection Symphony, so why was this so important in your mind as a kind of symbolic thing?
Well, as you say, the Mahler Second is just an immense, incredible piece of music. It is about the end of the world, essentially, which Mahler depicts extraordinarily, and then the resurrection, the continuing, the return of life. In February of 1941, the Kulturbund had shrunk from its original size. At its height in 1934, 1935, there were Kulturbund organizations in more than 50 cities across Germany, in Cologne, in Frankfurt, in Hanover, in Stuttgart, in Berlin, in Leipzig. But as time went by, more Jews, both performers and audience members, began to emigrate from Germany. And so by late 1939, only the Berlin Kulturbund remained, which is why my parents moved from Frankfurt to Berlin to play with the Kulturbund. And then as 39 became 40 and 40 became 41, there were fewer and fewer musicians who were members of the Kulturbund. And yet Rudolf Schwartz, the conductor, had this crazy idea that he wanted to do this immense symphony, which calls for a huge orchestra, an immense chorus. And he and some of his colleagues in the Kulturbund began going to nightclubs and finding, trumpet players who were playing jazz. Could they maybe help out on this one concert? And thereby the trumpet section of the orchestra was increased by one. There were a lot of amateur musicians who were found to either sing in the chorus or play in the orchestra. And everybody knew that time was beginning to run out. By this time, the country had already been at war for a couple of years, nearly 2 years. So in February of 1941, the Kulturbund managed to stage the Mahler Second. Again, it's such a huge piece that if you're the Milwaukee Symphony or the Chicago Symphony, it still is a big undertaking to do the Resurrection Symphony. For this group of ill-fed, ill-paid, always in danger Jewish artists to perform the Resurrection Symphony was something akin to a miracle. And everybody who was there just remembered it as being an unbelievable shot in the arm for the spirits of those who had remained.
Yeah, I was very moved. You quote, there's singing in this symphony, and there's you quote the text, and part of the text, Mahler didn't write the text, but some of it he actually did. And I just want to mention a couple lines that you bring in the book that I could see this Jewish audience listening to this Mahler symphony in German, and they could play it, of course, because he wasn't Beethoven, he was a Jewish composer, even though he converted, but one of the quotations in your book, two of the lines there, believe you were not born in vain. You have not lived and suffered in vain. You will rise again, my heart, in a moment and be born up through struggle to God. I mean, Mahler was dead already by the time they performed this particular thing, but think of that, the power of this Jewish audience in Nazi Germany in 1941 or 40, whenever that was, listening to this text. It's just like, it's incredibly riveting. So, and again, this has to do with music. This is going to be my last question for the moment, and we'll look at some of the questions that people are asking. But where does your title come from, The Inextinguishable Symphony?
As I write in the book, the last concert that the Kulturbund gave was on the 15th of May, 1941. Then they sort of, as they had done for the last 8 years, they would scatter for the summer and do summertime things. But the conductor, Rudolf Schwartz, wanted to look ahead to the next season, what he expected to be the 1941-1942 Kulturbund season. And he wanted to do this Symphony Number 4 by the Danish composer Carl Nielsen. Nielsen had written the symphony in 1916 as a reaction to the First World War. And he was just sickened by all the destruction he'd read about and heard about. But he was ultimately an optimistic man. And he declared that even if somehow mankind would wipe itself off the earth, life would return in the form of plant life or animal life. And he wrote at the top of the score, music is life, and like life, inextinguishable. So ever since its premiere in 1916, the symphony has been known as the Inextinguishable Symphony. And this struck me as the perfect title for this book.
Right. I mean, it's perfect because it's the last thing that they performed, and it's perfect because of just that content. The music is inextinguishable. So I just have a couple questions here in the Q&A. Please, if you're going to ask a question, audience, put it in the Q&A and not in the chat, because I'm monitoring the Q&A and not the chat. So one person writes, who's a professional musician and a teacher. She says, I'm wondering if you have favorite composers from that era, and what is it about their music that speaks to you?
I presume the audience member is talking about composers who were alive during the Holocaust.
That's the sense that I get, yes.
Or murdered during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. There are a number of composers who were sent to the camps, particularly the so-called model camp of Theresienstadt or Terezin. In fact, that is where Kurt Singer, the artistic director of the Kulturbund, ended up. He was sent to Theresienstadt, where he died, I believe, technically of starvation in the winter of 1939, 1940. And a number of other composers were there. The composer of a children's opera called Brundabar, which I find very moving. For the most part, the composers who were there wrote in the style of the time, which tended towards the less tonal and more towards the atonal, the more Schoenbergian style of composition, which I have to confess has always left me a little bit cold. So for the most part, composers from the 1930s and early 1940s in Germany don't really speak to me all that much, I must confess. Though Paul Hindemith, who managed to leave Germany and come to this country where he became a teacher at Yale for a long time, has some wonderful pieces, including a lovely work called Der Schwanendreher, which means the swan turner. He's evoking a hurdy-gurdy man turning the crank of his hurdy-gurdy. It's a fantasy on old folk tales and old folk tunes. And my mother was deemed good enough to be the soloist in a performance of the Der Schwanendreher with the St. Louis Symphony when I was just a kid. I remember that very fondly.
Wow. So I have a question here. Are there any recordings of any of the Kulturbund orchestra performances?
There are.
Yes, that was before YouTube.
Yeah, yes, it was. There are a few, tantalizingly few. There apparently were several recordings made of complete symphonies, but many of them, they were on these shellac records, and they were essentially taped over. I mean, that's nomenclature from our time of tape recorders, but they were recorded over, or they were destroyed during the Nazi years. But there are a couple of like 3 and 4 minute movements of divertimentos by Mozart with Joseph Rosenstock, one of the conductors of the Berlin Kulturbund Orchestra, conducting. And you can find them on some very, very obscure record label. If you Google Jewish Kulturbund recordings, you can find them. But considering how much marvelous music making that came out of the Kulturbund, it's frustratingly small amount of things that still exist today.
A lot of these musicians were superstars of their times, and it's remarkable.
Well, there is, as you say, Hans Wilhelm Steinberg, who became William Steinberg in this country. Boris Kreut was a viola player with the Kulturbund Orchestra. He came to this country and became the violist of the Budapest String Quartet in residence here in Washington, D.C. for many years. And Eugene Drucker, who is one of the violinists of the Emerson String Quartet, his father, Ernst Drucker, was the concertmaster of the orchestra in Frankfurt, my parents' orchestra. So my parents knew Herr Drucker. He then came to this country and joined the orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And the actors were terrific. When they made it to this country, many of them were asked, ironically enough, to play Nazis in war movies.
Because they had German accents.
Exactly.
Wow. So you actually half answered the next question. So what happened to the other members of the orchestra? Do you know who survived and how many and who did not?
My parents, as I say, and this is something my father would repeat to me over and over again, partially perhaps to deflect some of the guilt he was feeling. But he would so often say, we were so lucky. Your parents were very, very lucky. They were lucky to leave Berlin at the very end of May 1941. They managed to secure passage on the good ship Mugino, which left Lisbon in early June of 1941. But they had to get from Berlin to Lisbon. And they were placed in this train, which had its windows painted shut. So they couldn't see out, nobody outside could see in. They took that train from Berlin to Paris. They were allowed to use the underground lavatories in the Paris train station. And then the train continued to the Spanish border, where they got on a new train, which took them to Lisbon. And they got on the good ship Mugino in Lisbon and landed on Ellis Island on June 22nd, 1941. Less than 3 months later, on September the 11th, 1941, the Kulturbund was dissolved from one day to the next. The Nazis no longer needed it as a propaganda tool. They were at war. They had been at war for nearly 2 years then, and they didn't feel they needed that kind of propaganda. So really from one day to the next, everybody who had not gotten out by then were arrested and sent to the camps. One man who did survive, though he was indeed sent to one of the camps, I can't at the moment remember which one, but was Rudolf Schwartz, the conductor. Just before my parents left, he wrote them glowing recommendations that they could present to any orchestra in America. And in fact, they were able to secure jobs as musicians, thanks in part to what Rudolf Schwartz gave them. But Rudolf Schwartz managed to survive. He made his way to Bournemouth in England, where he continued to be a conductor and really increased his reputation a great deal. And he began teaching a number of students. And one of his most famous students was a fellow by the name of Simon Rattle. He's now Sir Simon Rattle. He was the conductor in London for a number of years. He was the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, kind of ironically enough. So one of the very best conductors of our time was taught by Rudolf Schwartz of the Kulturbund. But most of the members perished or were murdered because they didn't have the good fortune that my parents had.
So I have a question here. This is an interesting question. Were your parents allowed to bring their instruments with them to the United States?
My mother was not. My father did bring his wooden flute with him. They were each allowed one suitcase and a total of, they each had like $5 each, or the equivalent of $5. They each spent $1 to acquire or to be able to use a deck chair on the Mugino, so they could be out in the open air, not down in the lower part of the boat, which my father said reeked of burnt olive oil. But they were able to spend $1 each of them. So they arrived in this country, each of them with $4, literally. And my father's wooden flute, and they were lucky enough to make a very good name for themselves. One other brief story I'd like to tell is that after a few months in this country, my father realized that the wooden flute he was playing, the one you saw in that photograph, wouldn't be up to the American standards. So he really needed to acquire a metal flute. And he approached the organization, I guess the acronym is HIAS or HIAS, an organization.
Immigrant Aid Society.
Exactly, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS. And he appealed to them, and they sort of spread the word around that this young German Jewish refugee needs money for a metal flute. And so one day, just months after coming to this country, my father received this envelope in the mail, and he opened it up, and it was a check made out to him in the amount of $10 towards his getting a new flute. And it was signed Albert Einstein.
Oh.
The Albert Einstein had heard about him and sent him $10 for the purchase of a new flute.
That's wonderful. So I have a question here. I don't know if we can really get into it, about an unstated ban on playing Mahler or Wagner in Israel. I don't know. I mean,
and there's no ban on playing Mahler.
No.
Israel.
Absolutely none. And there's no ban on Wagner either, although it's, I mean, I remember when I lived in Israel, there was a performance of something by Wagner, it was booed. So it's not a very popular thing.
Right.
And one last question, I have a question too to complete, but this is someone's question. Do you know any stories about what happened to the other musicians' instruments?
They were mostly seized by the Nazis and probably sold, or they went to Nazi households. I mean, the musicians of the Kulturbund, I'm sure, were regarded as looted Nazi art was regarded. I mean, the spoils of war, or the spoils of just our being the Aryan race, and we get to keep these paintings, we get to keep these instruments. But they were all seized by the Nazis afterwards.
I'll just make one comment, and I don't want you to answer this. I'm going to tell everyone in the audience, you have to get the book to read about this. But his mother's father, who managed to get out of Germany to go to South America, actually had a Stradivarius. So if you want to know about that, read the book. So my final question, though, is, we talked about a little bit about how important these performances were, not for the musicians, but for the audience, these Jews that couldn't go to concerts. They went to the symphony, they went to all of these fantastic performances and concerts. And it wasn't just entertainment. It was something really profound. And so I wanted to ask you, are there any parallels to our own times about the arts, about music, about the importance of this to humans in America or anywhere worldwide? Do you have any ideas?
The arts have always been a place of inspiration and consolation. I think all of us have favorite pieces of music, favorite songs that we...
It doesn't have to be classical either,
Of course. Yeah. There are times when the only thing I really want to listen to is Bob Dylan's Desolation Row. There are days that are just like that. So I think in difficult times, I like to think of the more reliance on such things. And certainly over the last 20 months, when so many of us have been isolated from our fellow human creatures, I think a good deal of music has been consumed by us as consolation and sometimes as inspiration as well. I will be so curious to see the first great movie, the first great play, the first great book, the first great symphony, the first great string quartet, the first great dance to come out of the last 20 months, to see how artists respond. But I'm also reminded of a great line by the singer-songwriter Phil Oakes, who said, "In an ugly time, the best protest is beauty."
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to keep things as beautiful as we can in the face of ugliness of all kinds, medical ugliness and political ugliness, the best protest is beauty.
That I couldn't, there's nothing else we can end this with, but that is fantastic. That is really the perfect, le mot juste, the perfect word for the end of this.
And it turns out Phil Oakes was a Jew.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know that, of course.
So thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I'm honored to be involved with this interview, and buy the book. If you don't have the book, get it. It's available at Boswell's, and or
Amazon.com.
You can get it at Amazon, of course. And also, I mean, you can look for the trailer for the film that Martin mentioned. There's a dramatic theatrical film with a great German actor playing his father, and it's called Winter Journey. So you can look for that. There's an amazing trailer about it. And I would also, so thank you, Martin, so much. This has been amazing.
Thank
I'd
you,
like to
Jody.
thank Herc and the Harry and Rose Sampson Jewish Community Center and Congregation Emmanuel B'nai Yeshurun for co-sponsoring this wonderful program. So, oh, I see, this is in the chat, there is a link, I guess, to the trailer for the film Winter Journey. So again, thank you, and have, I guess, have a happy Halloween. It's not a very Jewish thing, but you never know. Thank you, and Martin, thank you. I hope our paths cross again.
I hope so as well, Jody. It was just a real pleasure speaking with you.
Great, thank you.